Thank you for joining us. I want to start off by asking you where the idea for this film came from.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I'm a journalist, print journalist, and have been for many years, and I've long been chronicling the AIDS epidemic. So this is a story that I wanted to go back to and try to make sense of the story of the plague years in America, really before 1996, when the effective medications came out that made surviving AIDS a possibility. And that's when I realized that that really a story from that time really needs to focus on the individuals whose activism helped bring us to those drugs and helped bring a close to the plague years. And that's a story of really the beginning of patient advocacy, the kind of modern patient advocacy movement, and the creation of these kind of citizen scientists who joined with the researchers to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Now, the construction of this film is very interesting in that it's about 95% archival footage. Can you talk about the reasons behind that and the gathering of the footage?
Sure. Well, and I knew this from being on the ground as a reporter at the time, but the camcorder revolution, the prosumer video revolution, was really at its infancy in 1987 when AIDS activism began. And the activists were among the first to really take up that technology and try and find social and political and cultural uses for video. The camcorder made it suddenly and for the first time affordable to create a kind of a moving image record of everyday events, and so that made it so that this was the first movement that got that kind of coverage, that kind of 360-degree, around-the-clock, self-generated kind of coverage of what was happening. It was important to them to do it because the mainstream media wasn't covering it, not in an effective way anyway. And so when I thought to go back to that time, I realized that the camera itself was a kind of a character in what was happening then. And I began a kind of an archival undertaking to see. It's kind of a forensic job to see if I could find enough of that footage to tell this 9-year kind of epic period of activism almost exclusively through that footage. And in fact, it was there. I brought in almost 800 hours of this vintage video, and discovered that you really could tell very intimate stories of a few people over that time period. And you could watch them grow older, you could watch them get sicker, you could watch them encounter challenges and overcome challenges, and ultimately find the path to victory that brought them to 96 in the end. But all that footage was shot by. I have footage from 33 different and independent videographers who, for the most part, weren't working together. They were working on distinct projects at distinct times within this period. But when you knit their various vantage points together, you really create what appears to be a kind of a verite film, kind of found in this old archives.
Mm-hmm. Now, you do have some interviews with survivors who are chronicled throughout the film. Can you talk about the experience of interviewing them?
Sure. I did about 90 hours of interviews, so I kind of was a little excessive about it. But I wanted to make sure that I understood the history properly and made sure that the story that we were finding in the archives, that we were making sense of it. I guess that's the challenge of kind of archaeology, right? That you have to understand the context in which the footage was shot, and that was really interesting. The folks that I invited to come and talk to me in the studio interviews, most of them were reluctant to do it, to open up their kind of memory vaults of those years. Because for one psychological reason or another, many of us who kind of survived those times have found ways to wall off the memories in order to make survival or kind of an ordinary ongoingness possible. And so it was a lot that I was asking for from them, and ultimately everybody that I invited to talk to me did agree to sit down and talk to me.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about the importance of doing this film now? What it is that you hope to achieve with this film?
Well, I was remembering, it's my first film, so I had never done anything like this before, but I was remembering what it was like when I first watched Eyes on the Prize, seminal documentary about the civil rights movement. And you know what that film did to me? It's not only did it give me an important history lesson, but it also made me realize that history was my history as an American. That it wasn't the history of African Americans for African Americans, but that it was part of the legacy that we have inherited as citizens. The knowledge of this incredible movement that created such change. And when I looked at AIDS activism and the project as it was developing, I thought that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to put the story and history of AIDS activism where it belonged, alongside those tremendous transforming moments in American history, and enshrine it really as part of that canon. And so that was my goal. I guess it was what makes the timing interesting of it is that I think in any traumatic period of history, it takes a period of time to go by before we can look back at that period with fresh eyes and understand its power and significance in the sweep of history. And in this case, it's been 16 years really since the drug developments changed the landscape for people living with HIV. And I think that's about the average amount of time for something like this. And when the film first appeared, we premiered it in Sundance last year, a year ago. Mm. And since then, I believe that it has rekindled a conversation about AIDS in a way that we haven't seen in a long time, in many years. That it has people talking again about not just the history, but about the present and the future, and the legacy that was left to us by these activists.
Can you elaborate a bit on that legacy? The lasting impact of these activists and their group. What they sort of helped us achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I have said for many years that I think that that a great deal of good has come out of AIDS, and it seems like a kind of an indefensible statement, but I mean the way that medicine and science is practiced today is all a creation of AIDS activists and AIDS activism. I mean, everything from the way AIDS drugs are researched and regulated by the NIH and the FDA, that was all recreated in this time, and you see it in real time in How to Survive a Plague. You see what the activists are doing and why they're doing it, and how that allows for drugs to be brought from idea and test tube to medicine cabinet in this incredibly condensed amount of time now, where it used to take 12 years. And cancer research has benefited from that. Breast cancer research into Alzheimer's, and all across the board has benefited from that. But also the way that doctors and patients interact today is revolutionized from the way it was in the 70s and 80s before AIDS. But also the modern lesbian and gay movement, the the push for marriage equality, the presence and role of gay people in civic life is all an outgrowth of what these activists were doing just 20, 25 years ago, and that's a tremendous legacy and an outgrowth of AIDS activism.
Mm-hmm. You said something once. I just want to find the quote here. If you'll give me just a second. Oh yes, here it is. You were talking about the interviewing the survivors last time we spoke, and you said they felt an obligation to the history. Can you just elaborate on that a bit, if you don't mind?
Well, what was it? Can you put the context there? Was I talking about why they agreed to speak with me ultimately?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
I mean, well, ultimately what they realized, these are the subjects of the film, who hadn't spoken really about this before, and what I realized as I was beginning this project, that this really history-making juncture, 15, 20, 25 years ago, has been lost to history. That nobody who wasn't there knows anything about it, and that's what ultimately had motivated all of us who worked on How to Survive a Plague to make sure that that it not get lost, to resurrect the story of incredible heroics in the face of a mysterious and killing disease, but one that had trumped every aspect of the scientific research establishment, from Nobel Prize winners on down, and how it took a bunch of people, kids mostly, with HIV, to figure out how to proceed and to find a way through that tunnel, and that's why any of us worked on this project. That's why they broke their silence, the people who are in the film. And I think that we see the value of that now. We see after this year of being on the in the theaters and being on the festival circuit, showing the film to people. We see how empowering and important it is to pass this piece of history along and to share it with the generations in a way that not only reminds them of how we got where we are, but what ordinary individuals are capable of.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's that iPhone ring.
Mm-hmm.
One last question. I just want to, if you could elaborate a bit on building your narrative. When you've got all this archival footage and you've got all these interviews, how do you start to, I guess, write the script of a documentary?
Right. Well, that's something, of course, I had no experience in before, and as we were going through the footage, and we brought in hundreds and hundreds of hours of this footage, as I said, every morning before I went into the cutting room, I watched a movie. Mm-hmm. To try to understand, try to learn, to teach myself the language of cinema. I thought, if these guys in this film can teach themselves, cellular biology and immunology and pharmaceutical chemistry with their degrees in theater and film studies, I could teach myself the narrative of a film, right? I could figure that out. And so, and at first I watched, documentaries, like every morning a film, and then I started watching, scripted films. And I realized that, in fact, that if you were to conceive of this story and it popped right out of your head and it wasn't historically true, you would call it a medical thriller. So that's what I started to watch, were like medical thrillers and political thrillers, and that was ultimately the language that I started to work with in the creation of the architecting of the structure of How to Survive a Plague. But I have to say that the biggest influence on that structure came from Paul Greengrass in his ability to start telling a story right in the middle, you know, and he tells stories that are true stories that he scripts, and I thought, well, that's what all this vintage video was allowing me to do, was like to join right in the middle of the battle, and to let the story unfold and let the viewer find his or her place in the story as it went forward. And so ultimately it was the film of his that I borrowed from the most was Bloody Sunday.
Oh,
And
right.
if you remember, Bloody Sunday opens up with a protest about to take place, and the police about to respond to that protest, and a kind of intercutting between those two. And so I borrowed that in kind of an homage to Greengrass in the beginning of How to Survive a Plague,
Oh, wow.
with the protesters making their plan, and the city in the form of the mayor, planning his response to that. And I mean, it was right there in the footage that you could make that kind of grand homage to that kind of storytelling, and then I let the rest of the story flow from there.
Mm-hmm.